Alright YouTube, it's time to talk about the differential short versus long-term effects of globalism. We are beginning, I believe, to make the transition from the more positive short-term impact of certain globalist policies, and we're steadily headed towards the rather negative impacts of the long-term use thereof. Short-term, what globalism has done in the world, especially in the wake of the Cold War sort of heating up, thawing out, going the way of the dinosaur, mostly. It more went into hibernation than it disappeared altogether. Sort of like a virus into the permafrost, slowly then melting over time. What ends up happening, short term, is that the interconnected web of economies in the world, because nations tend to become interreliant upon other nations, singularly or in collectives, they're not going to fight one another, at least directly. There may be proxy conflicts between the major members of one bloc versus another, but the other states, for the most part, they're not going to tangle with each other directly. There may be disputes, but they are worked out in diplomatic manners, they're worked out through economics, and ultimately states, even with significant degrees of disagreement on policies, on ethics, on anything under the sun, will attempt to work with one another, at least short term, specifically because their economies are interconnected. It would be like, for instance, North Korea and China. China's cheap manufacturing needs a lot of rare earth minerals, so they're willing to deal with the North Koreans because the North Koreans have a massive pile of them that they're able to extract cheaply. The North Koreans need food. They don't have enough arable land to even feed their whole population. They're willing to deal with the Chinese in exchange for food. Trade goes on. Neither member is capable of maintaining the degree of prominence economically or their stability if they give up those trade relations. What ends up happening long term, though, is that in any trade, typically as set up by nations, there is not necessarily a winner or a loser on the grand scale of an actual whole economy, but there are winners and losers within that economy. For example, with NAFTA between the United States and Mexico. I spoke about this prior. The United States and Mexico both are hit detrimentally by such an agreement. The United States loses a lot of its lower-level manufacturing positions as factories close up because they can be made more cheaply manufactured goods, lower or mid-level manufactured goods. In Mexico, they then get re-imported, and the cost is driven down and Mexican manufacturing flourishes. But then a lot of people here no longer have the money necessary to buy those goods because, of course, they lost their factory job. They lost their 25 or their 30 or 35K a year for a lower level position within one of these sort of typically unionized positions. They lost their middle income job. They lost their 50 or 60K a year. Maybe they do machining. Maybe they're carpenter, whatever. They've lost those jobs. Mexico, meanwhile, because of these agreements, can't provide positions for the more skilled and the more well-educated. They will come to the United States to compete for jobs. And they'll think that they're being paid a premium, even though they're going to be paid less than they could be making if not for such an agreement, because they will be able to potentially outcompete native workers. And so on both sides of the border, with such an agreement, you have bereaved groups of people who have been bereaved of their positions, potentially, within their own economies. Mexican intellectuals or more skilled laborers that don't have jobs in Mexico, they end up having to come here. People within the United States who want, sort of the lower middle or regular middle class position in a factory. They want to be a machinist or some other, higher tier blue collar worker. They can't find jobs. Long term, thus, what happens in these globalized arrangements where economies are sort of bound together by these systems rather than standing on their own and conducting trade in a truly free and fair manner, what happens is social alienation, just like what we saw after the First World War with the Treaty of Versailles and some of the fiscal arrangements and military and cultural changes made then. What ends up happening is people have the tendency to be long-suffering. That is, my theory here relies upon the general principle that humans are not quickly given over to anger and violence. However, they tend to unleash a hellstorm of anger and violence when they've been pushed too far. What globalism has done is tried to maintain its dominance for too long, because it clearly in its current form does not work. And so people increasingly, in different groups around different countries, are becoming alienated. You see, for instance, the pushback against the EU. Where is it most prevalent? Is it more prevalent in the Eastern European states or the Western European states? The Western European states. France and Denmark and some of these other countries and the UK are on the forefront of opposition to being members of the EU. Why? Because they're the ones that are disproportionately paying. But let's say for a moment that that was wrong, that all of these countries were paying and getting back out an equal share. I would still expect them to do the same thing because of the open border situation. And that's really what's going to kill off the European Union in the next decade, I believe. But it's the same all around the world. The actual arrangements made with a globalized trade deal, an interventionist deal between nations, the terms themselves mean very, very little. What ends up happening is that there will always be groups in one or the other nation that are feeling aggrieved. That is, that they don't support these things. They become more and more alienated. When it becomes clear that that group of people are feeling alienated, the government typically, what it ends up doing, one party will say, oh, well, we need to take care of this issue. That party becomes a new force within politics. And the older, more establishment political systems suffer. And they end up actually attacking these groups of people. Those same groups then, partially, in a justified manner, say, look, no, the government doesn't care about our native population. And even if it's a minority that's actually being hurt, for instance, blue-collar sort of union factory work, a few million people within the United States who have lost their jobs over time, is not a large proportion of the population, but it's a large enough group of people that are pissed off enough so that it can lead to the reformulation of political systems. Long term, what will end up happening, I believe, with globalism, is that it will be torn apart, and that nationalism will take hold all over the world. Communism will probably return to certain parts of the world that are opposed deeply to what we would consider like Nazi-style nationalism. The alt-right, more nationalism-light systems will gain dominance. Libertarian movements will gain dominance. The old political order, which essentially is bound, regardless of what party you're speaking of, the old political establishment here, the Democrats and Republicans. You look at the UK, you're looking at Labour and the Lib Dems and so-called Conservative Party over there. You look at other countries, you're seeing different parties with slightly different ideologies, but overall the one thing that cements them together is globalism. The one thing that they agree upon is that the interconnected web of economies keeps things more peaceful, and so even if it harms segments of their own population, it should be continued. The nationalists and alt-right and all of these other groups will attack that principle. They will call it what it is. They'll say it's pandering, it doesn't work, it certainly doesn't work for large swaths of the population in many nations. And what will end up binding these nations together long term won't be globalism, but opposition to globalism. Because parties in these countries that rise up to destroy it will naturally partner with one another on an ideological basis, even where they are antithetical to one another in the other terms and policies that they would seek to implement. Even longer term, when globalism starts dying off with great fervor, these parties will return to their old squabbles, and it will probably lead to the Third World War. That is really the problem. Globalism cannot be used forever. It disenfranchises too many people, too much. The amount of disenfranchisement grows. It leads to government corruption and stagnation. It leads to inefficiency. It grinds down economies. It won't last much longer. Another decade or two before globalism is basically just a cadaver. There will still be pro-globalist forces in the world. There will still be parties that espouse it, but increasingly they will be removed from power. Increasingly, People will begin to ignore what they say, they will not vote for their politicians, and so forth. The internet, by the way, is on the forefront of this. Just like the printing press destroyed the Catholic Church's stranglehold on Europe back at the dawn of the Renaissance, these days the internet is going to save the world from globalism. But that being said, we shouldn't necessarily think that what replaces it long term, we're talking decades or centuries beyond the death of globalism, is necessarily better, because again, the one thing that globalism has done well since being implemented so many decades ago is preventing an atomic war. And that really appears to be almost the reason why globalism was adopted in the first place. It looks like what happened is that some eggheads got together and said, the easiest way to prevent this calamity is to build our economy as massively as possible, draw other nations into a web of interconnected trade so that nobody would dare press the button first, because it would mean not only atomic destruction potentially, but it would also mean they would be closed off from world trade and they would fall behind the rest of the nations of the world. We would look at an isolated nation that only has one trade partner, like North Korea. North Korea is backwards. They're using 60s and 70s era technology. Their economy will continue to fall further behind the rest of the world that has embraced this kind of trade. But that trade comes with a deficit in human order. The trade comes coupled with social alienation, and it'll be cast aside. It's happened before. Such systems have been in place before. Somebody breaks some trade treaty back in the Dark Ages because it doesn't quite work from them, and war ensues. I don't expect it to ensue right away. I look at, for instance, the warm, slightly friendly, or at least appears friendly, situation between Nigel Farage, who's from the UK, has nothing to do with US politics, and Donald Trump, who's pushing a line of anti-globalist, vague populism. They appear to be on warm, friendly terms. Ideologically, they're not the same. Ideologically, the one thing binding them together, and the one reason why the Brexit went forward, is anti-globalist sentiment. It became the dominant issue in the UK. It will probably become a dominant issue within US politics. Indeed, if it weren't for terrorism, some people have said, oh, Trump's, he gains ground every time there's a terrorist attack. If terrorism was virtually non-existent, he'd be doing even better than he is now. Because he could focus more ably on globalism without all of these distractions. He could say, yeah, we're going to reform NAFTA and we're not going to sign the TPP. We're going to have fair trade, once again, between nations. We're going to not have all of these retarded schemes by which segments of the population suffer, and segments of foreign populations suffer too. And the economic counterpart is really twain, under globalism that is, with the social impact. The social impact of a globalized economy is that you have McDonald's in India and Indian restaurants in the United States. Now, at first, when these things are in the minority, they seem positive. Oh, I'm going to go try some Indian food. Oh, well, I'm going to go eat some McDonald's. But over time, it becomes more and more creeping. The nations, their cultures, at least in a peripheral, on a topical manner, they begin merging together. That disturbs most people. There is an innate human desire to preserve tradition. You may not want to admit that that desire exists. You may lie to yourself and to others all day and say that you don't care about such things. But I will tell you, even the most hardened social justice warrior has that deeply ingrained into them. They can subconsciously substitute something else for tradition, but they're going to fight for it with the exact same veracity. And that really is the new wave left. The new wave left is simply, as I stated, a moralist, a traditionalist movement that simply says the traditions and morals of the last half decade or so are what we will fight for. We want this to become the new status quo. They are still moralists. They are still traditionalists. They fight with the same vigor. They have the same style of values. They have the same general lack of common sense when it comes to pragmatism. They have the same innate tendency towards violence under situations of unreasonable levels of stress. They shout the same slogans or similar slogans. They're exactly the same as some extreme regressive traditionalist movement. In fact, I would argue that they're worse because there's not even a tradition there for them to base their beliefs on. They're the same thing. They're also nationalists. It's just that the idea of nationalism that they want to espouse, the nation that they see that they want to defend, is radically different from what some, alt-right group might want to fight for. But I expect that the social justice warriors, the new wave mentalities, are going to be the ones that die out. I don't think that they're around for good. When Ramsey Paul, for example, said, oh, well, the current political climate, whether Trump wins or not, and maybe he won't, it feels a lot like being in the bunker in the last days of World War II. I don't see it that way at all. I see quite the opposite. I see this as essentially all over the world. It's the 1930s, and new political movements are rising up as the old orders, in their stagnancy and decay, begin to lose ground and die off. This time around, though, it's not as simplistic as bunch of nationalists versus bunch of communists fighting to gain enough dominance to, legitimize their reign. It's not as simple as that. There are other movements now that have gained credibility and dominance. There's the literal nationalist movements and the literal communist movements. There are the socialist light reform movements. There are alt-right movements, or you could say quasi-traditionalist movements. The alt-right is almost a weird fusion of the ANCAP mentality with the National Socialist ideology. It's actually very simplistic to understand. You combine those two things, you basically get the alt-right. So that instead of wanting to burn Jews out of their homes, they simply want to do away with globalism and defang what they see as a degenerate world order, I suppose. You have libertarian movements. You have constitutionalist movements. You have people who use more violent means. You have anarchists and things like that. And then you have groups of people who emulate more peaceful protest. But all over the world, it doesn't matter really at this point where you look. The most insular or the most open states, those most or least affected by globalism, traditional culture is being displaced. This is the same in some fourth world shithole in Black Africa as it is in Singapore. It does not matter. The race of the people, the continent that they're on, what their borders are delineated as, no longer makes a difference. The fight against globalism a decade ago could be summed up as a reactionary measure against the negative impacts of the world economy and an increasingly homogenizing one-world culture on the Western first world literate classes of the world. That is, the middle and upper income bracket within, let's say, Europe, the United States, and maybe parts of East Asia. That was essentially the struggle against globalism. It goes deeper now. It's no longer a middle and upper class thing. The lower class has been affected now too. The lower class is perhaps the most affected at this point. It has spread from the first world to the developing world and is beginning to seep into the deep third world. It's the same everywhere. When I look at Africa and I look at the lashing out at the Chinese in places where they've put their money. Or even, you don't have to look that far away. Look at what's happening in Central America with the Nicaraguan Canal or anything like that. There is a huge resurgence of resentment against the Chinese. Now, the Chinese are not known as an imperialistic nation. Of course, when the age of imperialism was upon us, what was China? It was barbarian land. They were in the middle of a famine and people were eating each other. They didn't have any industry. They were still potato patch. It wasn't until the Great Leap Forward that they actually get industrialization. We saw the human toll of that because of communism, on full display in front of the world. It was a potato patch economy, or a rice paddy economy, I suppose you could say. Now they're moving into Africa to make their investments. And what does the native population say? We don't want them here. We're tired of it. They come here, they pump money in, but it doesn't benefit us. We're not getting paid anymore. And they're taking our women because they have all this money, so they pay for women, and they buy all the land, and we're sick and tired of it. You've got anti-China parties where that's basically the only message that they have, rising to dominance in parts of Africa now. The only legitimate reason of these parties existing is, hey, kick out the Chinese people that have invested here because the scheme is not fair enough to our domestic population. This is Africa. This is sub-Saharan third world Africa, where there is a lot of AIDS, a lot of famine, a lot of rural life, and then congested, sewer-swamped cities. And they're resentful at the Chinese because of their form of globalism. We would look at Eastern Europe once, where Russia was putting some of its investments. They don't want them there anymore. Look at what's happening in Poland. Look at what's happening all over Europe. All over Europe, governments are telling people, yeah, maybe we should get rid of the gun grabs, give people firearms at least a little bit, maybe give them some mandatory training. They have to have a license or whatever. They're scaling back gun control now in Europe, or at least talking about doing so in places like Germany, Poland, and elsewhere. They're saying, yeah, people should have like stocks of food and water. They're saying people should take part in paramilitary activities. They should have like training for civilians for firing weapons, field medicine, and stuff like that. Something I, by the way, have suggested we should do for years now, and I think it'd be a good idea. All over the world, regardless of race or ethnicity or creed, people have begun to lash out at globalism. It's not long for the world. Now, there are two ways forward for this. Either the world is united not by a trade system or by compulsion, but by the voluntary membership of nations, each acting on their own, under their own separate accords, but under one overarching ideology that benefits the people of their nations, with the intercession of fair trade between all states. Or we will fall into darkness because you will see the resurgence of, at least a Cold War, which would be much worse than just the rudiments of the Cold War we've already got going on right now in the wake of Obama's disastrous foreign policies involving the Russians. Or you'll see an atomic war. It'll be the end of human life as we know it, and much of the world's surface will be scarified by craters and burned into cinders. So those are our choices going forward. And so those are the short-term, more positive, not always, impacts of globalism. The problem is, the same globalism that's been preventing an atomic holocaust is going to cause an atomic holocaust. I don't think people quite thought it through with a truly long-term goal in mind. Because clearly, as the world population increased, it would become increasingly difficult for this system to be stable. Now, it only took a matter of a few decades the last time something similar to this in the interwar period was instituted in a nation. It only took a few decades for it to be cast aside, and look what happened. This time it's been in force for much, much longer. What do you think's going to happen when people wise up to the fact that it's not working all around the world and kick out these bums? Hopefully it doesn't lead to World War III. Although if you're really misanthropic, maybe that is what you're hoping for. That's about all. Peace out.